The compass hit the worn pine floorboards of Violet Bell's general store with a sharp, metallic ring, and the sound cut through the dusty afternoon air like a gunshot. She had thrown it. She had thrown it at Grant Barlow's chest, and he had let it fall, and now they stood on opposite sides of the counter staring at each other with the full weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them like the July heat over the Sonoran Flats. Her chest was heaving. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, falling in waves around her face, and her violet-gray eyes, the ones that had earned her a name she had never asked for, were bright and furious and broken all at once. "You left," she said, and her voice did not waver, which was the most devastating thing about it. "You left without a single word, Grant, not one. I woke up and your bedroll was gone and your horse was gone and I thought you were dead. I spent 3 months believing you were dead." Grant Barlow had not moved. He stood just inside the threshold of her store, trail dust on his coat, sun-darkened jaw unshaved, eyes the color of deep creek water in shadow. He was 31 years old, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something unbearable for a very long time. His hat was in his hands. He had taken it off the moment he stepped through her door, and she had known then, even before the words, even before the argument, that he had not come back by accident. "I know," he said. "You know," she repeated, and the bitterness in it made the air between them crackle. "That is all you have to say to me." "No," he said quietly. "It is not all I have to say. It is just the truest place to start." She shook her head and turned away from him, pressing her hands flat on the counter, staring at the rows of canned goods and bolts of calico that she had arranged and rearranged 100 times in the months he had been gone, because it gave her something to do with hands that could not stop trembling every time she thought of him. The compass lay on the floor between them, still spinning slowly on its face, the needle finding north the way it always did, relentless and honest. "Pick it up," she said without turning. "Take your compass and go. Whatever road you rode in on, ride back down it. Violet, do not say my name like that." "Like what?" She turned then, and the look on her face silenced him. "Like it means something to you. Like I mean something to you. Because a man who cares about a woman does not vanish at 4 in the morning and leave nothing behind. Not a note. Not a reason. Nothing." And Grant Barlow did something she had not expected. He did not defend himself. He did not reach for an excuse or a justification or the smooth kind of lie a drifter learns to wear like a second skin. He bent down slowly, picked the compass up off the floor, and held it out to her in his open palm. "I want you to keep this," he said. She stared at it. Brass and glass, worn smooth on the edges from years in a coat pocket, the face scratched but the needle true. She had seen him check it 100 times on the trail between Cedar Fork and Marigold Creek, seen the way he held it like a talisman, the way it was the one object he never set down carelessly. "Why would I want your compass?" "Because every direction I ever rode," he said, and his voice was so low and so serious that it reached into her chest and took hold of something there, somehow led back to here. She did not take it, not yet. Because there were too many secrets still standing between them, and Violet Bell had not survived 5 years alone on the Arizona frontier by ignoring the things she most needed to understand. This was the autumn of 1883, and Violet Bell had come to the town of Marigold Creek, Arizona Territory, under circumstances that had very little to do with romance and everything to do with survival. She had arrived in the spring of 1878, 23 years old, with a carpetbag, $40, and a letter of deed to a store that had belonged to her uncle, Herschel Bell, until a dry cough took him the previous December. She had come from St. Louis, where she had worked as a seamstress, and where her prospects had narrowed considerably after her mother's death left her without family or security. The deed was the only inheritance she had. She had read about Marigold Creek in a land prospectus, a small but growing settlement on the edge of the territory, serviced by a supply route from Tucson, populated by ranchers and miners, and the occasional traveler passing through on the way to somewhere else. What the prospectus had not mentioned was that Herschel Bell's store was barely standing when she arrived, that the town itself was less than 60 permanent residents, that water was scarce and summer was brutal, and the nearest doctor was 40 miles away in a town called Sorrow's Gap, which she considered an extremely poor sign. What it also had not mentioned was that the territorial land agent, a man named Desmond Fitch, had been quietly filing fraudulent claims on properties left vacant by death or abandonment, and that he had already decided Herschel Bell's store ought to belong to him. Violet had spent her first week in Marigold Creek understanding the lay of the land. She was not a woman who panicked. She assessed. She had seen the store, assessed its inventory, assessed the town's needs, and within a month she had reorganized everything, taken on credit with a Tucson supplier named Morales & Sons, and turned a half-dead dry goods operation into a functioning general store. She stocked what ranchers needed and priced fairly. She extended reasonable credit. She learned every person's name, and she did not gossip, which in a town of 60 people made her both remarkable and deeply trusted. Desmond Fitch she handled differently. He was a lean, humorless man of about 45 with pale eyes and a territorial authority badge that carried more weight than it deserved. He came to her store twice in her first month, and each time he explained, in tones of patient condescension, that her deed was likely irregular and that she ought to consider selling to him at a price he called generous, which it was not. She smiled pleasantly both times and informed him that she had already sent a copy of the deed to her attorney in St. Louis for verification, which was not entirely true. She had sent the deed to a former neighbor who had once studied law before drinking ended his ambitions, but it was enough to make Fitch slow down and wait. She survived her first year through stubbornness and precision. She survived her second year by building enough goodwill in the community that when Fitch made a more aggressive move against her deed, claiming that Herschel Bell had owed him money and that the store was collateral, 3 of the town's most respected ranchers stood up at the county hearing and testified to the legitimacy of her operation. The claim was dismissed. Fitch did not forgive her. By 1881, Violet Bell was a fixture in Marigold Creek. She was 26, self-sufficient, respected, and lonely in the particular way of people who have learned to fill every hour of the day with useful work so that the quiet cannot get in. She was not opposed to love. She had simply learned not to count on it. Grant Barlow rode into Marigold Creek on a Thursday afternoon in the March of 1882 on a copper-colored horse named Sable, which she thought was a strange name for a horse of that color, but which she later understood was not about the color at all. He had been riding for 2 weeks from the direction of New Mexico, and he needed supplies and a place to let his horse water properly. He came into her store and bought flour, salt, dried beans, and a spool of heavy thread for mending, and while he counted out his coins he looked up at her once with those dark creekwater eyes and said, without preamble, "This is a well-stocked store for a town this size. You must work very hard." It was not a compliment designed to charm. It was an observation made by a man who noticed things. She had responded, "I do," and he had nodded and taken his goods and gone. He came back 2 days later. He had intended, apparently, to pass on through to California, but Sable had thrown a shoe on the rocky trail west of town, and the farrier in Marigold Creek, an old Tejano man named Eduardo Vega, had told him the horse needed a week of rest before it was safe to ride long distances again. Grant spent that week doing odd labor for Eduardo in exchange for his lodging, and every day or every other day he would come by Violet's store to buy something small and to exchange a few words. She noticed that he was careful with money and not wasteful. She noticed that he helped a Navajo woman load her wagon without being asked and without making a show of it. She noticed that he read. He had a battered copy of a Dickens novel in his saddlebag, and that he was quiet in a way that was thoughtful rather than cold. On the 5th day of his stay, he came in late in the afternoon when the store was empty, and he stayed longer than a purchase required, and they talked about the territory, about water rights, about the Tucson supply routes, about how prices had shifted since the Southern Pacific laid its tracks. He knew a great deal about a great many things, and he spoke without showing off, which she found more impressive than confidence usually presented itself. "Where are you headed?" She asked him when the light had gone golden and she was preparing to close. "California," he said. "San Francisco, maybe, or up into Oregon. I have not fully decided." "What is in California?" He thought about this honestly, which she appreciated. "I am not entirely sure. I have heard it described as the end of something. I thought that sounded like a reasonable destination for a man in my position." She looked at him steadily. "And what position is that?" He looked back at her with those quiet eyes. "A man trying to put some distance between himself and the places he has already been." She understood that answer in a way she could not have explained to anyone, because it was her answer too, had been her answer when she climbed aboard the westbound train in St. Louis. The difference was that she had found a place and stopped. He was still searching for the place where the distance felt like enough. She did not pursue that thread further, but she thought about it for days after he rode out. He came back in August. Sable was in better condition, and he looked rested, though he had clearly been in the kind of country that takes its toll regardless. He bought supplies again, said he was heading to New Mexico for a spell, asked if there was anything she needed him to carry to Tucson or anywhere along the route. She said no. He lingered for 15 minutes discussing the drought conditions and what they meant for the ranches east of town. Before he left, he said, "I will likely pass through again." "Most people do," she said, because she needed to say something that was not what she was actually thinking. "I suspect I will do it more deliberately than most," he said, and he touched the brim of his hat and walked out. He came back in October, and then in January of 1883, and then in April. Each visit lasted longer than the last. By April, the visits had begun to feel like something with a shape to it, something intentional and accumulating. They talked for hours. They argued about land policy and agreed about kindness. He told her about growing up in Kentucky, about his father's failing farm, about the older brother who had stayed, and the way Grant had known by the age of 17 that he could not. He did not tell her everything about his dark past, and she could see the places where he stepped around things, but she did not push. She was carrying her own hidden weight. What she told him, gradually, was about her mother, a gentle, depleted woman who had loved a man who left and spent 20 years waiting for him to return, and who had died waiting, and who had never once seemed to understand that the waiting was the thing that was killing her. Violet had decided at 14, watching her mother wait, that she would be the kind of woman who went toward things rather than standing still for them. "And yet here you are," Grant said one April evening, sitting on the porch step of her store while the desert cooled around them, standing still in one place. "I went toward this place," she said. "That is different. I chose it." He turned the compass over in his hands. He did that when he was thinking, she had noticed, turned it over and checked the needle and put it away again. "There is a version of standing still that looks like courage," he said, "building something, staying when it would be easier to go. And there is a version of moving that looks like courage," she said, "but is really just fear wearing different boots." He looked at her sharply, and she met his eyes and did not apologize, and after a moment the corner of his mouth moved in what was almost a smile. "You are a difficult woman to be around," he said. "I am a direct woman," she said. "People confuse those things frequently." That was the night she knew she was in trouble. Not the light kind of trouble that flutters and passes, but the deep kind, the kind that reroots things. By June of 1883, Grant had been spending stretches of 2 and 3 weeks in Marigold Creek between his wandering trips. He had taken on some work for a local cattle outfit called the Rocking H, owned by a decent man named Foster Hale, who could use an extra hand with summer roundup. It gave him purpose and income between his drifting, and it kept him in proximity to Marigold Creek in a way that neither of them directly acknowledged was the real reason. The town had noticed, naturally. Small towns notice everything and interpret it with more authority than the facts support. Viola Mercer, who ran the laundry, told Violet plainly that Grant Barlow was a drifter and drifters never stayed, and that Violet was too sensible to let her heart follow a man who had one foot always aimed at the horizon. Old Eduardo Vega said nothing directly, but he watched Grant shoe Sable one morning with the careful attention of a man assessing character. And afterward he told Violet that Grant Barlow worked like someone who intended to be around for the consequences of his work, which Eduardo considered a meaningful distinction. The most complicated observer of the situation was Desmond Fitch. He had not abandoned his designs on Violet's property, and he had watched the growth of Violet's store with the particular resentment of a man who believes himself entitled to things he cannot take. He had come to understand that Violet Bell's standing in the community was the main obstacle to any further legal maneuvering, and he had begun to cultivate a different approach, one that involved getting close enough to appear friendly while looking for the leverage he needed. In June, he began making casual appearances at her store, buying small things, making pleasant small talk that was designed to lower her guard. She did not lower her guard, but she was careful not to make an enemy of him more actively than she already had, because she understood that Fitch still held enough territorial authority to make her life difficult in ways that a judge might not easily resolve. It was Grant who noticed the pattern first. "Fitch has been in here 4 times this week," he said one evening, leaning against the counter while she tallied her ledger. "He does not buy enough to account for 4 visits." "I know," she said. "What do you think he is looking for?" She set down her pencil. "He wants me to trust him enough to say something unguarded. He wants a slip in the deed story or some indication that I am struggling financially or some other weakness he can use in a filing." She paused. "There are men who cannot stand to see a woman succeed at something they wanted. It offends their sense of how the world ought to be ordered." Grant's jaw tightened. "Has he ever threatened you directly?" "Not in words," she said. "Men like Fitch never threaten directly. It is part of what makes them dangerous." Grant was quiet for a moment. "I want to say something, and I need you to hear it as information and not as interference." "Go ahead." "I have met men like Fitch in 3 territories. They wait and they probe and they look for the moment when you are distracted or vulnerable. If he cannot find the weakness he needs, he will consider creating one." She looked at him. "You are saying he might try to manufacture a problem." "I am saying it has happened before. A fire, a theft that creates an insurance dispute, a witness to something that did not actually occur, something that puts you on the defensive and forces you through a process that wears you out." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then she said, "What do you suggest?" And Grant said carefully, "I would like to be more visible here. Not in a way that suggests I have any authority over your business. I do not, and I would not presume, but visible in the way that makes a man like Fitch calculate his risk more cautiously." She studied him. "That is a significant thing to offer." "It is not a large thing to give," he said. "I have time and I have presence. I do not have a great deal else to contribute at the moment." What he said next changed the axis of things. "Violet, I am not asking to stay because of Fitch. I want to make that clear before you answer. I am asking to stay because I find that I do not want to leave." The store was quiet. The desert light through the west window was the deep amber of late afternoon. She could hear the sound of her own heartbeat. "That is the most direct thing you have said to me," she told him. "I am learning from the company I keep," he said, and this time it was a full smile and it reached his eyes and she felt it like a warm hand pressed against a place that had been cold for a very long time. She said yes. Not in those words exactly. She said, "I have a storeroom in the back that needs reorganizing. If you have time tomorrow morning, I would not refuse the help." And he understood her perfectly. July was the most beautiful month of Violet Bell's life up to that point, and she was aware enough of her own history to find that both wonderful and terrifying. Grant had begun staying in town full-time, sleeping in the tack room at Eduardo Vega's stable in exchange for help with the horses. Every morning he appeared at the store and did something useful, repaired the sagging porch rail, rehung a door that had warped in the heat, helped carry barrels. Every evening they sat on the porch or at the table inside and talked until the stars were well established in the sky. They talked about everything. About the territory and its violence and its beauty. About the injustice of how land was stripped from Apache and Navajo communities by the exact same kind of legal maneuvering that men like Fitch used against ordinary settlers, only with far greater brutality and on a vastly larger scale. Grant had seen it in New Mexico, and he spoke about it with a plainness that did not flinch. Violet had felt it abstractly and was grateful to have it named directly, because she found that honesty about hard things made the world feel more navigable rather than less. They talked about faith and doubt and the nature of hope. They talked about books. She had a small collection, Dickens and Eliot and a battered almanac she had memorized, and they argued passionately about whether the ending of Middlemarch was earned or resigned, and that argument lasted 3 evenings and never fully resolved. They talked about what they wanted. This was the most tender territory, and they approached it gradually, circling inward the way horses approach water when they are thirsty but cautious. Grant told her, one evening in mid-July while they sat on the porch watching heat lightning pulse along the southern horizon, that he had once tried to build something permanent. Back in 1879 in New Mexico territory, he had partnered with a man named Callum Roy on a small ranch. They had worked the land for 8 months, put in a real structure, run a modest herd. And then Callum had made a set of financial decisions without telling Grant, borrowed against the property, using Grant's signature on papers he had not fully read. And when the debt came due, Callum had disappeared, leaving Grant to manage the fallout. He had lost everything. Not just the ranch, but the sense of solid ground that had made the whole enterprise feel like more than a gamble. After that, Grant said, I did not trust myself to stay anywhere. I thought the problem was that I had let myself believe in something fixed, that the cure was to keep moving. Violet listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he had come to value about her most. When he finished, she said, Callum Roy was the betrayal, not the staying. You punished yourself for his dishonesty. Grant was quiet for a long time. I have thought about that, he said finally. I keep arriving at the same conclusion and then finding reasons to doubt it. What reasons? Myself mostly, he said. Whether a man who spent 5 years making himself deliberately rootless can be trusted to put down roots without running. She turned to look at him directly. I think that is a question only answered by trying, she said. And I think you already know that. I think that is why you keep coming back. He met her eyes. The heat lightning pulsed again, and in its pale glow she could see the exact moment when he decided to stop protecting himself from the truth of what he wanted. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the porch rail, and he held it with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands that what they are doing matters. Yes, he said, that is exactly why. She did not pull away. She laced her fingers through his, and they sat that way until the stars were fully out, and the night had cooled to something bearable, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else was needed. The first kiss happened 3 days later, and it happened without ceremony or calculation, which was how both of them had always privately hoped such things would happen. She was reaching past him to take a jar from the upper shelf, and he was standing too close because he had been helping her reorganize the back storeroom, and there was simply not enough space. And she turned with the jar and found his face 6 inches from hers, and neither of them moved away. And then it was not 6 inches, and then it was nothing. It was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that acknowledges everything that has already been said without words, that catches up in one moment to what has been accumulating for months. She kissed him back with the full conviction of a woman who has decided, and he kissed her like a man who has finally stopped running. When they separated, they stood looking at each other in the dusty afternoon light of the storeroom, breathing carefully, and Violet said, "Well," and Grant said, "Yes," and they both understood that the shape of things had shifted entirely, and there was no going back to whatever they had been pretending to be before. The happiness lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks of the kind of daily life that makes a person understand what people mean when they say they have found something worth protecting. They were careful with each other and also easy, which is the rarer combination. She learned that he woke early and needed silence until he had his coffee, and he learned that she thought out loud and needed someone to listen without offering solutions unless asked. She learned the history of the compass. It had belonged to his father, one of the few objects Grant had taken when he left Kentucky, and his father had used it to navigate during a time of personal crisis that Grant described only in outline. He learned that her particular way of going quiet and getting very precise with her words meant she was frightened rather than angry, and he learned to approach that differently than he had approached other people's silences. Fitch was watching all of this. Violet knew it. Grant knew it. But they were not looking for trouble, and the summer was too full of good things to spend it anticipating the bad ones. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday in the last week of August, and it arrived in the form of a man named Ray Doyle, who rode into Marigold Creek from the direction of New Mexico with a letter of introduction from the Territorial Land Office and a story about Grant Barlow that was designed to destroy everything. Ray Doyle was 40 years old, with a thick mustache and the confident manner of someone accustomed to being believed, and he presented himself at Desmond Fitch's office first, which told Violet everything she needed to know about his real loyalties even before she understood what he was claiming. What he was claiming was this: that Grant Barlow had been involved in a land fraud scheme in New Mexico Territory in 1879, that he had deliberately deceived a partner named Callum Roy, forged documents, and fled when the scheme collapsed, leaving Roy to face the legal consequences. He had a set of papers that appeared to support this, and Fitch was happy to circulate them. The story hit Marigold Creek on a Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon Violet had heard it from 4 different people, each one watching her face carefully for the reaction they were expecting. She did not give it to them. She said each time, "I will speak to Grant directly," and she meant it, and she did not let the fear that had opened up in her chest like a cold, hollow thing show in her face or her voice. She found Grant at Eduardo's stable at noon. He was brushing Sable, and he looked up when she came in and read something in her expression that made him set the brush down immediately. She told him what was being said. She told him plainly and completely, without editorial, and she watched his face while she did it. What she saw was not guilt. She had looked at enough people over enough years to know the difference between the face of a man hearing an accusation he deserves and the face of a man hearing an accusation that inverts the truth. And what she saw was the second thing: a hard, specific, complicated anger that contained within it the recognition of exactly how the inversion had been performed. "Doyle works for Roy," he said when she finished. "Callum Roy, the man I told you about." "I know," she said. "I assumed. Tell me what actually happened." He told her, and this time he told her all of it, the parts he had stepped around before, because there was no longer any reason to protect himself at the cost of her understanding. In 1879, Callum Roy had deliberately recruited Grant as a partner on the New Mexico ranch because Grant's family name, the Barlows of Harlan County, Kentucky, was attached to a defunct but still nominally registered land grant that gave the Roy Barlow partnership a credibility in the Territorial Land Office that Roy alone would not have had. Roy had manipulated Grant's signature on documents that were presented one way and meant another. When the scheme had collapsed, not because of any fraud on Grant's part, but because Roy had over-leveraged the whole operation against loans he had taken without disclosure, Roy had constructed a paper trail that redirected the blame and then disappeared before Grant could confront him. Grant had spent 4 months trying to navigate the aftermath, had lost everything materially, and had eventually concluded that the only thing that would prevent Roy from following him with the false narrative was to keep moving, that a drifter with no fixed address was a harder target than a man who put down roots and could be found. "So you have been running from a lie," Violet said. "Yes." For 4 years. Yes, she was quiet. The stable was warm and smelled of hay and horses and old leather. Outside, she could hear the ordinary sounds of Marigold Creek going about its afternoon, a wagon on the main road, the distant sound of Eduardo's hammer from the back of the yard. "And Roy has found you now," she said. "Not Roy personally. He sends men. This has happened before twice in New Mexico, once in Colorado. Someone arrives with papers and a story, stirs things up, and then moves on. Roy likes to know I am still paying for what he did." "Why?" she asked. "What does he gain at this point? The ranch is gone, the money is gone. What is the purpose of continuing?" Grant's expression was grim. "Roy has territorial ambitions. He is working his way into a position with the land office in Santa Fe. A man with a fraud conviction in his past is not useful to him, so he keeps the counter-narrative alive and moving." She understood this immediately. "And Fitch? Did Fitch contact Roy, or did Roy find Fitch?" "That I do not know yet," Grant said. "We need to find out," she said, "because if Fitch has been in contact with Roy, then this is not just a coincidence. This is coordinated. Roy wants to neutralize you and Fitch wants to neutralize me, and they have decided to do both things at once through you." Grant looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully name, something between admiration and something more tender and more frightened. "You see it quickly," he said. "I have been managing Fitch for 5 years," she said. "I have had time to understand how he thinks." She straightened. "We are not going to run from this." "Violet, no," she said, and her voice was entirely steady. "I have built something here, and you are part of it now. And I am not going to let a man who has been harassing me for 5 years, and a man who has been harassing you for 4 years accomplish, through each other, what they could not accomplish separately. We are going to dismantle this." Grant was quiet for a long moment. Then he said carefully, "What you are describing will require documentation. The real documentation from New Mexico, the records that show what actually happened with the Roy partnership." "Where are those records?" "In Santa Fe, in the Territorial Land Office archives, and with a territorial judge named Harlan Price who saw through Roy's version at the time but could not act on it without a formal complaint." "Then we need to file a formal complaint," she said. He looked at her with that expression again. "It means bringing Roy's attention fully to this location, directly. He has been comfortable harassing from a distance. A formal complaint changes that." "I know," she said. "Let him come closer. The closer a threat is, the more clearly you can see it." It was not simple and it was not fast. The next 6 weeks were among the most difficult of Violet's years in Marigold Creek. The story Ray Doyle had circulated did its damage regardless of its truth, because stories always do their first damage before the correction arrives, and some people who had been friendly and warm became reserved and distant. One of the ranchers who had testified for her against Fitch's deed claimed 5 years earlier. A man named Percival Lodge came into her store on a Friday morning and said, with visible discomfort, that he thought she ought to be careful about who she aligned herself with, and she thanked him for his concern and did not give him the comfort of her agreement. The ranch where Grant had been working, Foster Hale's Rocking H, let him go. Foster Hale was not an unkind man, and he apologized while he did it, saying that until things were clarified, he could not afford the association. Grant took this without anger and thanked Foster Hale for the work he had already been given, which made Foster Hale look deeply uncomfortable, as it was designed to. Eduardo Vega, who was not a man moved by rumors, told Grant he could continue using the tack room as long as he needed it. Grant thanked him and meant it, and Violet began writing letters. She wrote to Judge Harlan Price in Santa Fe, a precise and detailed letter laying out the history of the Roy Barlow partnership from Grant's perspective, and requesting guidance on what formal filing would require. She wrote to the Territorial Land Office in Tucson requesting records related to any complaints against Grant Barlow's name, so she could understand exactly what existed in the official record. She wrote to a woman she had once corresponded with in the St. Louis newspaper trade, a sharp and resourceful person named Adela Crane, asking whether she had any contacts at the Santa Fe papers who might be interested in a story about land office corruption. She did not share these letters with Grant immediately. She told him about them after she had sent them, and he sat at her table reading the copies she had kept, and was very quiet for several minutes when he finished. "You did not ask me before you wrote them," he said. "No," she said. "I was afraid you would ask me not to." He looked up. "I might have. I know, that is why I did not ask." She paused. "Are you angry?" He set the copies down carefully. "I should say yes," he said. "It is my history you are putting into letters to strangers. It is your history being used against you by people with dark motives," she said. "And I am not a woman who watches that happen to someone she cares about and does nothing." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the complicated feeling moving through him, the gratitude and the fear of it, the relief and the residual terror of trusting someone with the full weight of a thing you have carried alone for years. "I am not angry," he said finally. He stopped. "I have been alone with this for a very long time. It is an adjustment being defended." "You will get used to it," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Violet Bell," he said, "you are the most formidable human being I have encountered in 31 years of encountering people." "I have had to be," she said, "but thank you." It was somewhere around this time, in the hard middle of things, that Grant disappeared. Not slowly, not with warning. One night he was there and the next morning he was not, and Sable was gone from Eduardo's stable, and there was no note, no word, nothing. Violet stood in front of the empty tack room in the early morning light and felt the bottom of something give way. She had known this fear was possible. She had known, in the rational part of her mind, that a man with 5 years of running practice might run again when the pressure reached a certain point. She had chosen to trust him anyway, because refusing to trust anyone was not a life she wanted to live. But knowing you have made a considered choice does not make the consequence of that choice hurt less when it arrives. She spent 3 months in a state of controlled grief. She ran her store. She continued the Let Her campaign on his behalf, because she was not going to stop doing the right thing simply because he had not had the courage to stay for it. She received a response from Judge Harlan Price that was cautious, but substantive. Price had always doubted Roy's account and said as much carefully, and indicated that a formal filing from Grant Barlow directly would allow him to reopen the matter. She wrote back and explained the situation and asked what could be filed without Grant's physical presence, and Price wrote again, and they went back and forth, and slowly the architecture of a real counter case began to take shape. She did not hear from Grant. She told herself the story in as many versions as she could manage, and none of them fully satisfied her. Perhaps he had panicked. Perhaps Roy had found him before he could reach her. Perhaps he had decided that she and everything she was building was a complication he was not ready to handle. Perhaps. Viola Mercer said she had told her so. Old Eduardo Vega said nothing at all, which was more respectful and more painful. What actually happened was this. On the night he left, Grant had been approached by Ray Doyle outside Eduardo's stable. Doyle had delivered a message. Not from Roy this time, but from Fitch, and the message was a threat of a specific kind, that if Grant remained in Marigold Creek, Fitch would find a way to file a criminal complaint against Violet's store, claiming that she had knowingly harbored a fugitive from territorial justice, and that the store's deed would be subject to seizure pending investigation. It was exactly the kind of manufactured problem he had warned her about months ago. Grant had believed, in the panic of that moment, that the only way to protect her was to remove himself from the equation. That if he was gone, Fitch's leverage was gone, and Violet's store was safe. He had been wrong in the particular way of people who act from love but without consultation. He had made a decision about her life without asking her, and in doing so, he had removed her agency and caused her the exact kind of pain he was trying to prevent. He had ridden to New Mexico because that was where the problem's root was, and because if he was going to come back, and he had known, even in the first miles of riding, that he was going to come back. He needed to come back with something in his hands. He had ridden to Santa Fe and found Judge Price, which was where he discovered that Violet had already been corresponding with Price for weeks, that she had already built most of the case he was attempting to build, and that the judge had a very clear picture of what was happening. The look on Price's face when Grant introduced himself and explained his connection to the Marigold Creek situation had contained a particular quality of dry amusement. "Mr. Barlow," Price had said, "you have a correspondent in Marigold Creek who has been considerably more active on your behalf than you have been on your own." Grant had sat with that for a moment and then said, "Her name is Violet Bell." "It is," Price said. "And she appears to be a woman of remarkable intelligence and determination. If you are the reason she is engaged in this matter, you ought to think carefully about whether you deserve that." Grant had thought about it. He had thought about almost nothing else for 3 weeks while he helped Price's office compile the documentation needed for a formal fraud complaint against Roy, while he gave his own full testimony for the first time in 4 years, while the territorial machinery began slowly turning in the direction it should have turned in 1879. Roy had been notified that a formal complaint was being pursued. Roy had responded through his attorney, which meant he had taken the threat seriously. Fitch had been contacted by the Territorial Land Office regarding his coordination with Roy's representative. Doyle's visit to Fitch's office had been documented by the Marigold Creek postmaster, a meticulous man named Thomas Webb, who had noted the arrival of correspondence from Roy's Santa Fe address in the weeks preceding Doyle's appearance. The case was not finished. These things moved slowly, but it was moving, and Grant had believed that was enough to come back with. And so he had ridden back to Marigold Creek 3 months after he left and walked into Violet Bell's store on an autumn afternoon with trail dust on his coat and his hat in his hands, and she had looked at him like a woman whose heart had been through a hard country and come out the other side with its borders firmly established. She had picked up his compass from the counter. He had set it down while reaching for something else, and she had thrown it at him, and he had let it fall. And he had picked it up, and he had held it out to her and said the truest thing he knew how to say. She stood looking at the compass in his outstretched palm for a long time. The needle quivered and settled on north. She thought about what it meant to be the thing that the compass points toward. She thought about what it meant that this man, this drifter, this careful and complicated and deeply foolish man, had ridden away from her for 3 months and come back with her letters already sent and her work already done and his apology insufficient and his offering the most honest thing he owned. "You should have told me," she said, "about Fitch and the threat. You should have told me instead of deciding for me." "I know," he said, "I was wrong. I had a right to make that choice myself. It is my store, my life." "Yes." "And I would have chosen to fight," she said. "You knew that. You knew I would have chosen to fight, and that is why you did not tell me, because you were afraid of what it would cost me and you did not trust me to decide what I am willing to pay." He met her eyes and did not flinch from any of this. "All of that is true," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You filed the formal complaint with Price." "Yes." "And it is moving forward." "Yes." Roy's attorney has already indicated that Roy will likely negotiate rather than face a full hearing. Fitch's coordination is documented, and the Territorial Land Office in Tucson is aware of it. Thomas Webb kept records. She nodded slowly. "I know, Price wrote to me." Grant almost smiled at this. "Of course he did. He told me you appeared in his office and filled in the parts of the picture that my letters had not yet reached," she said. "He said you were clear and thorough and that you gave your testimony without qualification." "I should have done it 4 years ago," Grant said. "Yes," she agreed. "You should have." She looked at the compass. "But you did it now." She reached out and took it from his hand. The brass was warm from his palm. She held it and felt the weight of it, the solidity, the worn smoothness of something that had been carried a long time. The needle pointed north. She thought about directions and what they mean, not just toward but away from, and the difference between the two, and whether a man who had spent years moving away from things was capable of moving toward one. She thought about the look in his eyes when he said the truest thing he knew how to say. She thought about 3 months of letters sent on his behalf, 3 months of carrying a case forward for a man she was furious at, and missed with the specific sharpness of someone who has let themselves care completely. She thought this is what love actually is. Not the easy part in the summer evenings, not the kisses in the storeroom or the arguments about Middlemark. It is the staying and the letters and the choosing and the forgiving and the insisting on the truth even when it costs something. You left without telling me, she said, and I need you to understand fully and without mitigation that if you ever make a decision of that kind about my life again, about what I can handle, about what I deserve to know, I will not forgive you a second time. I understand, he said, and I need you to understand that I am not someone who waits, she said. I do not wait the way my mother waited. I act. So if you are in this, if you are truly in this with both feet, with no part of you still aimed at the horizon, then we act together. We make decisions together. That is the arrangement. Grant held her gaze. I am in this, he said, completely with both feet. She held the compass out to him. Then keep this, she said, because if you are staying, you do not need to navigate by it anymore. You are already where you are going. He took it from her hand, and she felt his fingers close around hers for a moment before he took it, and it was the kind of touch that seals something. I am sorry, he said simply and fully. I know, she said, and she did, and she was. She came around the counter, and she put her arms around him, and he held her with the careful fierceness of a man who has finally stopped protecting himself from the thing he most wants. And they stood that way in the autumn afternoon light of her store in Marigold Creek, Arizona Territory, in the year 1883, and the compass was in his coat pocket, and the needle was pointing wherever it pointed, and neither of them was going anywhere. The weeks that followed were the work of rebuilding, and rebuilding is always harder and more interesting than the thing that preceded it. They were more honest with each other than they had been before, which is usually how it works. A rupture that is survived tends to clear away the layers of careful presentation that two people maintain while they are still deciding how much to trust each other. The pretense was gone. What was left was entirely real. Grant moved out of Eduardo Vega's tack room and rented a small room above the hardware store from its owner, a quiet widow named Clara Pierce, who charged him a fair price and asked no questions. It was a modest arrangement, but it was his own, and it felt different from a tack room in ways that he had not expected to care about. He went back to work for Foster Hale, who had heard through Thomas Webb about the documentation linking Fitch to Ray Doyle, and had the decency to appear at Grant's door with his hat in his hands and offer a straightforward apology. Grant accepted it straightforwardly. He was not a man who held grievances longer than they were useful. Fitch, faced with the documented evidence of his coordination with Roy's representative and the Territorial Land Office's interest in the matter, had grown notably quieter. He was still in Marigold Creek, still held his badge, but he was no longer appearing in Violet's store with his manufactured pleasantries. He knew that the ground had shifted. He had made a significant miscalculation in assuming that Grant Barlow was someone he could use to get to Violet Bell, not understanding that the actual result of bringing Doyle into Marigold Creek would be to push Violet Bell and Grant Barlow into a formal legal action that illuminated Fitch's own behavior far too clearly for comfort. In November, a letter arrived from Santa Fe confirming that Callum Roy, through his attorney, had agreed to a formal settlement, an admission, in legal language, that the 1879 New Mexico partnership had involved documentary fraud on Roy's part, and a relinquishment of any claim to pursue Grant Barlow further in any territorial jurisdiction. Roy was protecting himself from a full criminal hearing which he would have lost. Grant read the letter at Violet's table on a Tuesday evening, reading it twice before he set it down. She was watching him. "Is it sufficient?" she asked. "It is more than I expected to get," he said. 4 years ago I thought this was completely unsolvable." "Everything is solvable when you stop running from it and turn around to face it," she said. He looked at her with a warmth so visible it was almost uncomfortable to sit across from. "I have been told," he said. She poured them each a small glass of the good whiskey she kept behind the counter for occasions that warranted it. They touched glasses and drank, and it was simple and complete and tasted like a rival. The matter of Desmond Fitch resolved itself somewhat more slowly, but just as thoroughly. In December of 1883, the Territorial Land Office dispatched an investigator from Tucson to look into the documented correspondence between Fitch's office and Roy's Santa Fe address. The investigator, a precise and unhurried man named Garrett Tilson, spent a week in Marigold Creek, interviewed Thomas Webb and several others, reviewed Fitch's official filings over the previous 3 years, and departed with a significant quantity of paperwork. By February of 1884, Fitch had been removed from his position as Territorial Land Agent. He left Marigold Creek on a Thursday morning without speaking to anyone, and his departure was noted by the town with the same matter-of-fact assessment with which the town noted most things as a fact established, a chapter closed. Violet stood on her store porch and watched his wagon clear the edge of town and disappear into the flat desert distance, and she felt the particular lightness of a burden set down that has been carried so long it no longer feels like a burden, just a permanent condition of the body that you have forgot is not necessary. Grant was standing beside her. He said nothing. He did not need to. She put her hand through his arm and he covered it with his hand and they watched the empty road together. 5 years, she said. Done, he said. Done, she agreed. It was Grant who spoke first about the future in explicit terms, which surprised her. She had expected that conversation to require more approach, more careful circling. But he brought it up on a Sunday morning in March 1884, in the kitchen behind the store where she made her coffee in the mornings, and kept a small collection of practical books and a single geranium in a clay pot on the windowsill. He had been there every morning for months, and one morning he sat down with his coffee and said, "I have been thinking about what this is and what I want it to become." "Tell me," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have wanted to for a long time and I have been building towards saying it, and I think the approaching is taking longer than the saying deserves." He paused. "I understand if you need more time or if the answer is not yes right now. I am not issuing an ultimatum. I am stating a fact about what I want and asking you to tell me what you want." She set her coffee cup down. "Grant Barlow," she said. "Violet Bell," he said. "The answer is yes," she said. "It has been yes for longer than I would like to admit." He let out a breath that sounded like a man who has been holding something for a considerable time. "Good," he said. "That is very good." She smiled, and it was the full kind, the kind she did not produce often and which consequently carried a great deal of weight when it appeared. "You are going to have to ask Eduardo Vega's blessing," she said. "He will be offended if you do not." "Eduardo Vega is not your father," Grant said. "No," she agreed. "He is better than most fathers. He was here when they were not." Grant nodded seriously. "I will ask him tomorrow." He did, and Eduardo Vega put his hammer down and looked at Grant Barlow for a long, measuring moment, and then said, in the careful English he used when he wanted to be certain nothing was misunderstood, "You understand what you are promising. This is not a trail you can ride away from." "I know," Grant said. "She built this herself," Eduardo said. "You are not taking over something she built. You are walking into it as a partner, equal." "I understand." Eduardo was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "She has been alone a long time, not for lack of suitors, for lack of someone worth not being alone for." He picked his hammer back up. "Do not give me a reason to be wrong about you." "I won't," Grant said. They were married in May of 1884 in the open air beside Marigold Creek itself. The actual creek, not the town, a narrow ribbon of water that ran year-round from the hills to the north, lined with cottonwood trees that were just coming into their summer leaf. The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher named Aldous Cook, a cheerful, weathered man who had married half the couples in the Eastern Territory, and who read the words with the confidence of someone who believes in what he is saying. The whole of Marigold Creek was there, or nearly all of it. Thomas Webb, the postmaster, who had kept the records that helped bring Fitch down, stood in the front and wiped his eyes without embarrassment. Foster Hale from the Rocking H came with his wife and 3 children. Clara Pierce from the hardware building, who had rented Grant his room and asked no questions, brought a spectacular pie as a wedding gift and stood in the back with her arms folded and a satisfied expression. Eduardo Vega stood beside Violet and gave her his arm when the preacher asked who stands with this woman, and there was nothing performative about it. He was simply there, as he had been from the beginning, solid and present. Violet wore a dress she had made herself from the finest calico the store stocked, a deep indigo blue that she had always liked and had never had occasion to wear. She had embroidered the collar and cuffs with small flowers in white thread, working in the evenings for 2 weeks. She wore her hair up with 2 ivory combs that had belonged to her mother. She looked, Grant thought when he saw her, like a woman who had built something real and knew it, who was standing in the full confidence of what she had made and choosing to make it larger. He was not a man prone to poetry, but he found himself reaching for it. She was the direction he had been moving toward without knowing it. She was north, on every compass he had ever carried. Preacher Cook spoke the words and they each spoke theirs back, looking at each other with the steadiness of people who have already been through the hard part and are not afraid of what comes next. When Cook pronounced them husband and wife and Grant took her face in his hands and kissed her, the sound that went through the gathered crowd of 60-odd Marigold Creek residents was the particular kind of sound that happens when people are genuinely moved rather than performing being moved. Eduardo Vega produced a fiddle from somewhere. No one had known he played, which may have been deliberate, and the afternoon turned into an evening of music and dancing on the flat ground by the creek, with paper lanterns strung between the cottonwood trees and a long table of food contributed by everyone present. Violet danced with Grant until she was too happy to be graceful, and then she danced until she was graceful again, and the stars came up over the desert, and the creek ran quiet and silver in the lantern light, and for a long evening Marigold Creek was the most beautiful place in the Arizona Territory. The life they built after that was a real one, which means it was full of ordinary difficulty, and also full of the particular kind of joy that ordinary life contains if you are paying attention and are with the right person. Grant became a true partner in the store, not a figure in the background but a working participant with real responsibilities, which he took seriously, and which he turned out to be good at, having a natural ease with the ranchers and travelers who formed the bulk of the trade, and a practical knowledge of what the territory needed at any given season. They made the store larger in the first year of their marriage, adding a proper back room and a small office where they kept the accounts. Violet found that she liked sharing the accounts with someone who was equally precise, and who caught the occasional error she made when she was tired in a way that was matter-of-fact rather than pointed. Grant found that he liked having a reason to be in one place, liked the way the same roof looked different at different times of day, liked knowing the names of every person who walked through the door and having the names come back in return. He hung the compass on the wall of their small parlor behind glass in a simple wooden frame, where the morning light caught the brass and made it glow. Violet had looked at it one morning a few weeks after they hung it and said, "You know you don't need it anymore." "I know," he said. "That is why I want to keep it, so I never forget how I found my way here." She had kissed him for that, which was one of the better things she had done in a morning that was already good. In the spring of 1885, Violet confirmed what she had been quietly suspecting since January. She told Grant on an evening in April, standing in the kitchen with the geranium blooming orange in the window and the sound of the desert settling into night outside, and she told him simply, holding his hands, watching his face. He was still for a moment, the stillness of a man absorbing something very large, and then his face did something she had not seen it do before, something younger and unguarded and full of a wonder that had no defenses around it. He held her hands tighter and said her name very quietly, and then he said it again, and she laughed at the second saying because he sounded so entirely unlike his usual careful self, and the laugh turned into something wetter than she intended, and he gathered her in and held her, and neither of them said anything for a long while because everything had already been said. Their son was born in October 1885, on a cool night with a bright half-moon. Eduardo Vega was there because Violet had asked him to be, and because he was the closest thing either of them had to family in the territory, and he sat on the porch of the store through the long hours and did not leave. The baby arrived healthy and loud, announced himself to Marigold Creek with the conviction of someone who intends to be present, and Grant held him in the small hours of the morning with an expression of such profound and helpless love that Violet, who was exhausted and should have been sleeping, watched him from the bed and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled her whole life. They named him Thomas Herschel Barlow Thomas for Thomas Webb, who had kept the records that turned the tide, and Herschel for Violet's uncle, who had left her the store and the means to make a life. Eduardo Vega, when told of the naming, nodded with quiet approval and said nothing, which from Eduardo was equivalent to a speech. Thomas was a serious baby who became a curious toddler with his father's dark eyes and his mother's way of watching things before deciding how to respond. Grant taught him the names of stars when he was old enough to stay awake and look at them. Violet read to him in the evenings, everything she had on the shelves, starting with the simple things and moving into Dickens earlier than most mothers would have considered appropriate, because she believed in underestimating children less than the world generally did. He appeared to agree with this approach, listening with the focused attention of someone storing information for later use. In 1887, a circuit court ruling finally formalized the full dismissal of all claims against Grant Barlow stemming from the 1879 New Mexico Partnership, with an official finding that the documentary fraud had been Roy's. Grant received the letter on a Tuesday and put it in the fire because he had been done with that particular weight for years, and the paper was just paper. Violet watched him do it and understood completely. Callum Roy himself had been quietly discredited in Santa Fe. The Roy-Fitch connection, when it became clear, had damaged Roy's territorial ambitions considerably, and by 1887 he had retreated to Texas, where he presumably continued to be the kind of man he was in someone else's jurisdiction. Violet did not waste thought on him. The store continued to grow. By 1888, Marigold Creek had expanded significantly. The territory was settling in the way of things, more families coming west, more infrastructure appearing, and what had been a modest operation was now a substantial one, the center of the town's commercial life. They had hired 2 young people to help with the operation, a sharp and hardworking young woman named Rosalie Vega, Eduardo's niece, who had come up from Tucson and showed every sign of being someone who would eventually run her own enterprise, and a young man named Silas Webb, Thomas Webb's youngest son, who was methodical and honest and good with numbers. Grant had also begun, in a quiet way, to use his knowledge of the territory accumulated over years of drifting its roads and trails, in a way that was actually useful rather than merely restless. He knew the terrain as well as anyone in the region, and he had developed a sideline as a guide and consultant for survey parties and legitimate land development operations, work that took him away from Marigold Creek occasionally but for specific, defined purposes with specific, defined return dates, which was an entirely different thing from drifting, and which he found he enjoyed without the old anxiety about staying. He always came back. He always wrote when he was out long enough to send a letter. He always brought Thomas something interesting from wherever he had been, a feather, a river stone, a small carved thing from a trading post. Thomas had a collection of these objects on his windowsill that he arranged and rearranged with great seriousness. In the summer of 1889, when Thomas was 3.5, Violet told Grant she was expecting again. Grant received this news with somewhat less stunned surprise than the first time and somewhat more immediate joy, and he pulled her onto his lap in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon in the store's office in a manner that would have scandalized Viola Mercer at the laundry, if Viola Mercer had been present to witness it, which she was not. This baby arrived in January 1890 in the same room, on an even colder night, with even more snow on the mountains than there had been in October of 1885, which the midwife said was a good sign, though she did not specify for what. A girl this time, born with her mother's dark hair, and a quality of absolute determination visible even in the first hours of her life. They named her Clara Me Barlow Clara for Clara Pierce at the hardware store, who had rented Grant a room above her place when he needed it, and asked no questions and brought spectacular pie to their wedding, and me because it was a good sound and it fit. Clara Pierce herself, when informed of the naming, sat down abruptly in a chair and was quietly emotional about it for several minutes before rallying to remark that it was a lot of pressure to put on a name. She became, in practice, the baby's most devoted unofficial grandmother, appearing regularly with opinions about Clara Me's development and various gifts of impractical but beautiful things. Thomas, at 3.5, regarded his sister with the gravity of a person encountering something new and trying to decide how to file it. After several days of cautious observation, he concluded that she was interesting and announced that he intended to teach her things, a project he began immediately with characteristic seriousness. The years that followed had the texture of a good life carefully tended, not without difficulty or loss, because good lives are not exempt from those things, but built on a foundation solid enough to bear what came against it. They weathered dry years and the occasional hard winter. They mourned Eduardo Vega when he died quietly in the spring of 1891, peacefully in his sleep, which was the way he would have wanted, and they sat with his passing in the honest way of people who have loved someone and are grateful for it rather than pretending the grief is not real. They attended the territory's changes with interest and some alarm. The speed of settlement, the violence of displacement, the disappearance of ways of life that had existed in the Sonoran Basin for centuries before European boots touched the ground. Grant spoke about this with the plainness he had always had, and Violet listened and thought and said her own piece. And Thomas and Clara Me grew up in a household where these things were named and considered rather than looked away from, which their parents believed was the most important thing they could teach. The general store became, over time, more than a commercial enterprise. It was where people came for information, and for the particular kind of practical help that Violet had always given, quietly and without keeping score. When a family arrived in town in the mid-1890s after a terrible journey and needed help establishing themselves, it was Violet and Grant who organized the town's response, the donated supplies, the temporary housing, the connection to work. When a dispute arose between two ranches over water rights in 1893, Grant was one of the people who helped mediate a solution that did not require a lawyer or a judge. He was trusted, which was different from being known, and he had spent 15 years earning the difference. In 1897, Marigold Creek was officially incorporated as a proper town, and at the first town council meeting, Violet Bell Barlow was elected to the council by a vote of the residents that was not close. Grant, who was present and who had voted for her along with everyone else, thought about her coming off a train in 1878 with $40 and a carpetbag and a deed to a half-dead store, and he felt something in his chest that was too large to be called pride, but which was in that family. She sat on the town council for 4 consecutive terms and ran the store for 30 more years, and was one of the most respected figures in the eastern Arizona territory for the remainder of the century, which she carried with the same straightforward practicality with which she had carried everything else. On a September evening in 1898, 15 years after the autumn afternoon when he had walked back into her store with trail dust on his coat and his hat in his hands, Grant Barlow sat on the porch of the house they had built behind the store, a real house, with a proper parlor and 3 bedrooms and a porch that ran the length of the front, and watched Thomas, now 13, showing Clara Me, now 8, how to use a compass to find north. Thomas was explaining it the way his father had explained it to him, in the practical terms of someone who takes navigation seriously, and Clara Me was listening with the focused attention she brought to everything, asking questions that were more sophisticated than an 8-year-old's questions had any right to be. Violet came out onto the porch and stood beside Grant, and he moved to make room for her against his shoulder, and she settled there in the way of 2 people who have spent years learning exactly how they fit. She will figure out the magnetic declination before he finishes explaining it, Violet said quietly. Almost certainly, Grant agreed. She gets that from you, Violet said. She gets that from you, he corrected. She laughed softly. They watched their children in the early evening light, the desert going gold and copper around them, the mountains to the north holding the last of the sun. 15 years, she said. From the day I walked back in, he said. Yes. You had your hat in your hands, she said. I always have my hat in my hands when I am about to say something I am frightened to say. I know, she said. I noticed that the first time, too. He turned to look at her. 15 years had marked them both in the ways that 15 years mark people who have lived fully in them, the particular lines around eyes that have spent years in bright light and in laughter, the ease in each other's company that requires no performance, the way they communicated in small gestures and omissions as much as in words. I would do it all again, he said. Every piece of it. The years of running before I understood what I was running from. The coming here and leaving and coming back. All of it. If every piece of it led to this. She considered this seriously because she was a woman who considered things seriously. Even the terrible parts. The terrible parts are why the rest of it means what it means, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I kept your compass. I know. It is on the wall in the parlor. I know, he said. I put it there. I look at it sometimes, she said. In the mornings, when the light hits it. What do you think about when you look at it? She thought about this honestly. I think about the fact that you navigated by it for 15 years and what you were actually navigating toward, she said. And I think about the fact that you did not know it for most of that time. She paused. And I think that most people spend their whole lives not knowing what they are navigating toward. And I think we are very lucky that you found out. He held her tighter. Across the yard, Thomas had handed the compass to Clara Me and was watching while she oriented herself and found north, and then, with the swift, instinctive precision that was entirely characteristic, found every other direction in sequence. North, she announced and pointed. South, east, west. Good, Thomas said, with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student has vindicated the lesson. I know, she said, with the cheerful certainty of someone who was never in doubt. The compass needle held steady. The evening light lay across the desert in long, warm bands. In the parlor behind them, on the wall where the morning light found it, the old brass compass was already pointing at everything it would ever need to point at. The needle settled on true north, still and certain, the way things are when they have finally come to rest in the right place. Violet Bell Barlow leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and breathed in the cool edge coming into the evening air, and felt the solid, familiar warmth of him beside her, and knew, as she had known on a certain autumn afternoon 15 years ago when a compass had fallen to the pine boards of her store, and a man had picked it up and told her the truest thing he knew how to say, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be, not because she had waited for it, because she had built it and fought for it and chosen it and been chosen for it, and because the man beside her had eventually stopped running and understood that all roads had been leading here, that every direction he had ever ridden had somehow brought him home. The stars came out over Marigold Creek, one by one, the way they always did, finding their places without ceremony, without confusion, without any doubt about where they belonged. And the compass on the parlor wall pointed north. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.